What's up guys, my name's Stu, and today we're going to be looking at my Total Odyssey theme build. Yep, I am playing around with the Lexington again, and I have done something kind of silly this time. I've called it the Total Odyssey build because it incorporates every console from every single version of the Odyssey. So that includes the Tier 5 consoles, the Tier 6 consoles, even the new console of the Lexington. I guess I should have called it the Total Lexington build, but whatever. The thinking behind this is to be sort of a canon-inspired build for the Odyssey. I know the Odyssey isn't officially canon yet, but you get what I mean. There are multiple Tier 6 versions of the Odyssey, but for this build I decided to go with the Lexington, and that's because of all the C-Store versions, this one is definitely the most powerful. This is going to be an energy weapon build, so the Miracle Worker seating on this version will be much more valuable than the Command seating on the other versions. Plus it has a Hanger Bay and a Spinal Lance, and those are just fun. Like I said earlier, this is meant to be sort of a canon-inspired build for the Odyssey, which is why for the weapons I am using a bunch of Agony Phasers, because they look just like standard phasers, but Agony Phasers have a better proc. But if you don't feel like spending the resources to get a bunch of Agony Phasers, you can get by just fine with standard phasers if you prefer, or really any kind of energy weapons. I also threw in the Terran Task Force Phaser Beam with these because it is an exceptionally powerful energy weapon, and it looks close enough to a normal phaser that I really can't tell the difference. That's just me though, if you want to leave it out, feel free to replace it with something else. Because this ship has a 4-4 weapons layout, I'm mostly running it as a broadsider, meaning most of my damage is going to be focused to my sides rather than my forward arc. Because of that, and because this is meant to be a canon-inspired build, I'm using the wide-angle quantum torpedo. This actually comes off of any C-Store version of the Sovereign class. It looks just like a normal quantum torpedo, except it has a full 180-degree firing arc, so it's much easier to use while broadsiding. In the back, I also have the Trilithium Omnidirectional Phaser, which comes from the episode Beyond the Nexus. With a broadsider like this, you really don't need an omnidirectional beam, because they actually do less damage than a normal beam array, but it's still not a bad idea to keep one Omni on the build for the sake of a set bonus or a special effect. In this case, it's the Trilithium Omni's proc, which gives me a chance for a haste buff. Up here is my usual energy weapon setup, the Protometer Deflector from the Fleet Colony for its buff to crit chance and crit severity, the Competitive Reputation Engine for the speed buffs, a Warp Core from the Fleet Spire, this is for its reduced weapons cost and the Amp mod, and the Discovery Reputation Shield for its damage buff against enemy shields. In the devices, again, my usual setup for an energy weapon build, energy amplifiers for the bonus damage to my energy weapons, deuterium surplus for the speed buff, reactive armor catalyst in case I need a quick heal, Kobayashi Maru transponder for the random buffs, and red matter capacitor for the buff to my power levels. Now, the consoles are pretty predictable, because as I said earlier, nearly all of them are from versions of the Odyssey. I'll start with the consoles from the Tier 5 ships. First is the Aquarius Escort. As its name suggests, this allows you to launch the Aquarius Escort out of the back of the Odyssey. While active, it'll fight alongside you until it's disabled, in which case you'll need to recall it. The chevron separation functions in much the same way. This allows you to separate the saucer section of the Odyssey, in which then it will fight alongside you. It's not as powerful as the Aquarius Escort, but the trade-off is that the lower section that you're commanding will receive various stat changes. So you'll receive a buff to your weapons power, flight speed, and turn rate, but receive a small debuff to your shields and auxiliary power. Another downside to both of these two consoles is that you can't use them at the same time. You can only activate Aquarius Escort or Chevron Separation, not both. This has always felt really silly to me, especially in the current state of the game, because neither of these pets will do any sort of significant amount of damage, so it seems silly to restrict them like that. I wish they would go back and remove that limitation, but what can you do? The third console is called Worker Bees. What this does is launch 4 Worker Bee pets that follow you around and will heal you. Though honestly, it is a very small heal and you will probably never notice it. Because these 3 consoles are from a set, there are obviously set bonuses. The 2-piece gives you a small buff to turn rate, lowers the cooldown of these 3 consoles by 25%, and gives a small buff to your energy damage resistance skill, your kinetic and physical damage resistance skill, and your power transfer rate skill. And when I say small buff, I do mean small. Plus 12 is hardly worth even mentioning, honestly. The 3-piece bonus is supposed to buff the chevron separation, giving the Odyssey saucer section to launch its own Worker Bees and to use Gravity Well 3. Though, frankly, I have never actually seen it use either of those abilities, so I am pretty confident that this part of the set bonus is actually broken. Not that it would make much difference even if it did work. Now let's move on to the Tier 6 set, which I promise I will be much less negative about, because I actually like most of the consoles in this set. First is Flagship Tactical Computer. Its passive buff gives a small buff to your energy weapon damage, but its real power is in its click, which gives a 33% buff to firing cycle haste to your energy weapons for 15 seconds. It also buffs your flight speed and turn rate by 50%, and applies these buffs to the whole team. That haste buff makes this kind of like a budget version of the Domino. Its only downside is that, since it affects the whole team, only one can be active at a time, kind of like your fleet abilities. so after one's been activated, the whole team will be on a 60-second lockout from these. Actually, I'm wrong, that actually has one more downside, which is this console can only be used on variations of the flagships. This kinda sucks because I would love to use this on pretty much any beam overload build. The same restriction applies to these next two consoles. Adaptive Energy Systems, which has a very powerful click ability, which grants a 30% bonus damage buff to all damage, which lasts for 30 seconds. Additionally, if your hull starts dropping, that buff will actually get even higher. All that bonus damage means this is actually a pretty decent budget alternative to the DPRM. Next is Dampening Wave, and of the Tier 6 consoles, this is the only one I'm not a fan of. It has a lame passive ability, and its click is just a radiation AoE that gives some damage over time. This build is really focused on energy weapons, so radiation damage really isn't going to do much. This would probably be of better use on an EPG build, because radiation damage is an exotic type damage. But again, this console is restricted to the flagships, and the flagships all being cruisers and dreadnoughts, I probably wouldn't put an EPG build on any of them. So this one's really just here for the set bonuses. The last of this set is called Timeline Stabilizer. This one creates a 3-kilometer area of effect around you. Any enemies within that field will receive debuffs to ability recharge times, impulse speed, and turn rate. Additionally, it'll also give you a buff to your firing cycle haste, and give a small reduction to your own bridge officer and captain's abilities. Now, the funny thing about this console is that, despite being part of this console set, it's not actually from one of the Odyssey variants. This console comes from the Krenum Science Vessel, which is an old event ship. So newer players wanting to get their hands on this console are going to need an Epic Phoenix token. The bright side is that since this console was from an old event ship, that means this is the only console that isn't actually restricted to one of the flagships, so you can actually use this console on any ship. The set bonuses on this console set actually aren't bad. The 2-piece gives you a buff to critical chance, which is always good, and a buff to turn rate, which is definitely useful on a ship this size. The 3-piece is called Deadly Response. Anytime you receive damage on a depleted shield facing, you get a chance to receive a stack of Deadly Response. Each stack gives you a 10% bonus damage buff and some temporary hull, both of which will last for 10 seconds and can stack up to 3 times. And the 4-piece is just called Flagship Technologies, which just slightly buffs the click abilities of the first 3 consoles. For Adaptive Energy Systems, it lowers the minimum hull requirements from 50% to 75%, so you can get that extra bonus damage quicker. It increases the duration of Flagship Tactical Computer from 15 seconds to 20, and increases the radius of Dampening Wave Emitter from 4 kilometers to 5. Also on here is Multi-Directional Artillery Barrage from the Lexington. While this console isn't part of the Odyssey console set, the Lexington is still an Odyssey variant, so this still very much fits the theme. Its click ability will fire off a barrage of torpedoes in every direction. You'll gain a bonus damage buff for each foe within one of your firing arcs, plus an additional bonus damage for each number of foes. The torpedoes this console launches look just like standard quantum torpedoes, which kind of further reinforces the whole cannon theme. This next console, I really questioned on whether or not I should use it on this build, but I really wanted it, so I did. And that's Immolating Phaser Lance off the Deimos Pilot Escort. I felt it worked for this ship because, well, it does have a Phaser Lance. Well, the Lexington does. Yet another reason why I probably should have called this the Total Lexington build. And honestly, I really like this console. Pressing the button and having this huge phaser beam shoot out from your ship, it's very satisfying. It also does an impressive amount of DPS. However, if you don't want to use this console, or cannot afford this console because it is lockbox, it's not cheap, there are plenty of alternatives you could use. The DPRM or Domino are obvious choices, though some good budget alternatives could be Reinforced Armaments. That way you'll get the 2-piece bonus with the Trilithium Omni Beam. Or if you unlock the Jarok Alliance carrier, you could use its console, Sensor Suppression Burst. Its passive has an impressive buff to crit chance, and its click ability gives even more crit chance. It also further buffs your hangar pets, so this is actually really useful in the Lexington, which does have a hangar bay. In the tactical consoles are just a bunch of vulnerability locators to buff my crit chance and my phaser damage, though thinking back on it now, I probably should have replaced one of these with Lorca's Custom Fire Control, because that actually has more crit chance than one of these. Actually, there's another budget replacement for the Immolating Phaser Lance too. Take that out, take one of the consoles in the universal slots and move it down here, and then put Lorca's in one of the universal slots. Why didn't I think of that sooner? Anyway, the last piece of gear is the Alliance Fighter Squadrons. This is here because they have Focused Assault 3, which will greatly buff my own damage plus that of everyone else on the team. Also because there really aren't a lot of theme-appropriate Starfleet fighters for something like this. There's the Type 8 shuttles, which are technically era-appropriate, but man, those things suck. Same with the Yellowstone runabouts. There's the Peregrine fighters, but honestly, those don't feel thematically appropriate either to me. Because at this point, the Peregrine fighters are probably like 35 to 40 years old at this point, so why would a brand new Odyssey-class be equipped with them? So I went with the Alliance pets because I really couldn't think of a better option. Hopefully one day Starfleet will get some actual 2409 era pets. For my specializations, as usual, I'm using Intel Officer as my primary, that way I get access to space flanking, and Temporal Operative as my secondary to get access to Entropic Rider. For the personal traits, first I'm using Adaptive Offense for the crit chance buff that turns into a crit severity buff and then back, Context is for Kings for the bonus damage buff, Fleet Coordinator for the bonus damage buff based on my team size, Fragment of AI Tech to buff my energy weapon damage based off my control expertise skill, Innocuous for the small buff to crit severity and the reduced threat generation, Inspirational Leader for the chance to buff all of my starship skills, Intel Agent Attaché to lower the cooldown of my captain's abilities, Superior Beam Training for the bonus damage buff to my beam weapons, Terran Targeting Systems for the buff to crit severity, Unconventional Systems to lower the cooldowns of my universal consoles, and the Boimler effect to help with my Bridge Officer cooldowns. For the starship traits, first is Emergency Weapons Cycle off of the Arbiter Battlecruiser. Every time I use emergency power to weapons, this will lower my weapons power cost and buff my firing cycle haste. Next is Overpowered and Overgunned off the Legendary Defiant. This does pretty much the same thing as the last trait, but is triggered off of beam and cannon firing modes. Next is Directional Modulation, which comes off of this ship, the Lexington. Anytime I activate a Miracle Worker Bridge Officer ability or Directed Energy Modulation, I gain a small stacking bonus damage buff based on the number of enemies within 5 kilometers of me. This trait is here largely for the sake of the theme of this build. It's my total Odyssey theme build, so I wanted to have at least one starship trait that actually came from one of the Odyssey variants. In fact, I actually used 2, because the next trait on the list is Supercharged Weapons off of the Endeavor Tactical Starcruiser. Anytime I fire a torpedo, I gain a stack of Supercharged. This can stack up to 3 times, and each one will give me a 10% buff to damage, 1.5% crit chance, and 6.6% crit severity. Each stack will last for 20 seconds. Next is Entwined Tactical Matrices off the Gagarin Miracle Worker Battlecruiser. Every time I use Fire at Will, it'll give me a hit of Torp Spread 1, and every time I use Torpedo Spread, it'll give me a hit of Fire at Will 1. This should allow me to keep Fire at Will up pretty much 100% of the time. I'm using this because I wanted to make this a Fire at Will build. I've already made cannon-inspired beam overload builds, so I wanted to try this out instead. And honestly, for a theme, I've always preferred Fire at Will over beam overload, just visually speaking. A big dreadnought like this, I want it to fly in firing beams in every freaking direction as quickly as possible. Though if you'd rather use beam overload, then I would swap this out for super weapon ingenuity. And lastly, Strike from Shadows off the Shran Pilot Escort. This will reduce my threat generation and give me small buffs to crit chance and bonus damage every time I fire on an enemy that isn't targeting me. The reduced threat generation will actually be really helpful because this is a Fire at Will build. Fire at Will is notorious for generating quite a bit of threat, and this is not a tank build. For the reputation traits, first I'm using Advanced Targeting Systems for the buff to crit severity, Tyler's Duality for the buff to crit chance based on my hull capacity, Precision for more crit chance, Magnified Firepower for the bonus damage to my weapons, and Controlled Countermeasures for the bonus weapons damage against controlled targets. Now for the Bridge Officer seating. First, in the Lieutenant Commander Universal seat, I'm using as a Science seat. First is Jam Targeting Sensors and Scramble Sensors, both of which are here to trigger unconventional systems. Gravity Well is here to get some extra control on my enemies, and is also an unconventional systems trigger. I know I've said this is sort of like a cannon-inspired build for the Odyssey, and Gravity Well isn't normally something I would use on one of my cannon-inspired builds because it's not something you normally see them use in the show, but it's my build, shut up. The Odyssey isn't technically canon, so who's to say what it can or can't do? And the Lieutenant Commander Tactical seat, first is Chemosite Lace Weaponry 1 to get some extra radiation damage on my weapons, Torpedo Spread 2 to buff my torpedoes and to trigger Entwined Tactical Matrices, and Fire at Will 3 to buff my beams. In the Lieutenant/Intel seat, first I'm using Viral Impulse Burst, this is also only here to trigger unconventional systems, and Attack Pattern Beta for its debuff. Though I probably could have gone with Electromagnetic Pulse Probe instead, because that would also be another unconventional systems trigger. In the Commander Engineering/Miracle Worker seat, first is Emergency Power to Weapons, this will give me some bonus damage to my energy weapons, and triggers Emergency Weapon Cycle. Emit Unstable Warp Bubble is another unconventional systems trigger. Narrow Sensor Bands gives a bonus damage buff to my energy weapons that scales based on the distance to my targets, and with Mixed Armament Synergy, anytime I activate a certain weapons type, it will buff the other 3 types. So in this case, if I fire a torpedo, it'll buff my beams, and if I fire my beams, it'll buff my torpedo. And lastly, in the Ensign Science seat, Tractor Beam for another unconventional systems trigger. And now the Duty Officers. These really won't be a surprise if you've been here before. 24 of 47 to buff my power levels and my crit chance, 27 of 47 to buff my crit chance and crit severity, 3 Projectile Officers for a chance to buff my crit chance or crit severity anytime I fire a torpedo, and 39 of 47 to help with the cooldowns of my Tactical and Miracle Worker Bridge Officer abilities. Now let's go watch the ISE and then have a look at the parse. 241k DPS. I always say, if my goofy theme builds can get over 200k, I'm happy, and this is no exception. Fire at Wills 1 and 3 did most of the damage for this build, which is to be expected, it is a Fire at Will build after all. My pets did 14k, most of that coming from the Alliance fighters. Immolating Phaser Lance came in at just under 13k, which is a bit surprising. Normally I can get more damage out of that, though I normally use it on forward-facing builds. This console only has a 90-degree firing arc, so lining it up for a broadside build is a bit more difficult, so I wasn't able to fire it off as many times as I normally would. I definitely should have gone with the Alliance Carriers console instead. The Dampening Wave Emitter did 3.5k, which is very not impressive. Like I said, this one's here just for the theme and the set bonuses. Now, one last thing I'm noticing, I don't see the Chevron separation or the Aquarius anywhere on this parse, though I do see my ship's name listed under the pets, so I'm wondering if that's one of, or even both of them. In either case, this just shows you how terrible their damage is, because they only did about 900 DPS. Yeah, that is my total Odyssey theme build. I hope you enjoyed it. Admittedly, it is not the most clever build I've put together, but it really makes for a nice theme build, largely in thanks to how powerful the flagship technology set is. Anyway, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel and I do appreciate it. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.